They say the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was convincing the world he didn't exist. But in the case of Robert Sylvester Kelly, the trick was different. He didn't hide. He performed. He sang his sins in Born Time, and sold them back to us as platinum-certified romance. Welcome to Society Noir. Today, we aren't just looking at a fallen star, we are dissecting an architect. An architect who built a sprawling, invisible fortress out of hit records, non-disclosure agreements, and the collective desire of a global audience to look the other way. For 3 decades, R. Kelly wasn't just the King of R&B, he was a ghost haunting his own palace. He managed to bridge the gap between the soulful grit of the Byre Moose and the glossy pop of the Hang-Ins, becoming a cultural titan who seemed untouchable. But beneath the velvet suits and the soaring vocals lay a blueprint of systematic predation so calculated, it rivals the most twisted fictional thrillers. How did he do it? How does a man with a well-documented trail of wreckage continue to fly for 30 years? The answer isn't just in his music, it's in the way he weaponized the very concept of the celebrity. To understand the architect, you have to understand the foundation. In the early teen moves, R. Kelly brought a new vibe to the world. It was smooth, it was street, and it was hypersexualized. But while the world was vibing to bump and grind, Kelly was busy constructing his first layer of defense, commercial indispensability. In the music industry, money doesn't just talk, it silences. By the mid-teen moves, Kelly was a one-man hit factory. He wasn't just making money for himself, he was a pillar of the economy for Jive Records. He was writing for Michael Jackson, Whitney Houston, and Celine Dion. When you are the golden goose of a multi-billion-dollar industry, your eccentricities are rebranded as artistic temperament. Kelly mastered the art of the public confession. Every time a rumor surfaced about his preference for underage girls, he didn't go to the news, he went to the studio. He wrote songs like Religious or I Wish, wrapping himself in the cloak of spirituality and persecution. He forced the audience to choose. Do you believe the vulture tabloids? Or do you believe this beautiful, soulful man who is crying on track 4? He knew that as long as the hook was catchy enough, the public would provide the benefit of the doubt. This was the first brick in the wall, the narrative of the misunderstood genius. If the music was the shield, the inner circle was the cage. Kelly didn't just date, he recruited. He looked for a specific profile. Young, talented, often from broken homes or seeking a way into the industry. To them, he wasn't a predator, he was a mentor. He was the king who could make their dreams come true. But once they entered his domain, whether it was his Chicago mansion or his tour bus, the architecture changed. This is where the architect of nightmares truly showed his hand. He didn't use physical chains, he used totalitarian control. Reports from survivors describe a set of house rules that sound like they belong in a cult. No one could eat without his permission. No one could use the phone. They had to ask to go to the bathroom. And most importantly, they had to address him as Daddy. He surrounded himself with enablers. Vested interests, bodyguards, assistants, and scouts, whose job was to ensure the conveyor belt of young women never stopped. They were the janitors of his soul, cleaning up the legal messes, intimidating families with payoffs, and enforcing the NDAs. This was the velvet cage. On the outside, it looked like the pinnacle of R&B royalty, expensive cars, private jets, and champagne. On the inside, it was a panopticon where the architect was always watching, and the only way to survive was to obey. Every structure has a weak point. For Kelly, the first major crack appeared in Matngin Chin Trum Chin Moy Born. It involved a rising star, a Muy-year-old girl named Aliyah. The world saw a mentor and a protege. The architect saw a way to codify his control through a fraudulent marriage. When Vibe magazine published the marriage certificate listing her age as Muy-term, the blueprint was exposed. It was the first time the public saw the lengths Kelly would go to bypass the law. And yet, the building didn't fall. The marriage was annulled, the parties remained silent, and Kelly did what he did best. He released another hit. He wrote, I Believe I Can Fly for the Space Jam soundtrack. How do you cancel a man who provides the anthem for an entire generation's hope? You don't. You let him keep building. You let him add more floors to his dark tower. Every architect fears the same thing. a hidden flaw that finally reaches the surface. For R. Kelly, that flaw arrived in a plain brown envelope delivered to a Chicago journalist. Inside was a videotape, the smoking gun that would define the next 2 decades of his life. The tape didn't just show a crime, it showed the architect's inner sanctum. It stripped away the music, the lights, and the King of R&B persona, leaving behind a middle-aged man and a minor. The world could no longer claim they didn't know what the blueprint looked like. They had seen the rooms inside the tower. But this is where the noir turns into a legal thriller. Because despite the tape, despite the outrage, the architect's fortress was reinforced with something stronger than steel: doubt. The Hang In Ler Tam trial was supposed to be the end. It was the siege of the tower. Prosecutors had the tape, they had the witnesses. But they underestimated the architect's greatest defense: the cult of personality. Kelly didn't just fight the charges in court, he fought them in the streets. Outside the courthouse, fans held "Free Kells" signs. Inside, his defense team performed a masterclass in atmospheric distraction. They didn't argue that the tape wasn't disgusting, they argued it wasn't him. The defense focused on the quality of the video, the graininess, the pixels. They turned a moral certainty into a technical ambiguity. In a world before high definition, they sold the jury a reasonable doubt based on facial recognition and body measurements. When the verdict came in not guilty on all counts, it wasn't just a win for Kelly. It was a message to his victims. The architect is more powerful than the truth. He walked out of that courtroom not as a man who had been cleared, but as a man who had been consecrated. He was now the survivor. He returned to the studio and recorded "Untouchable." The tower hadn't fallen, it had just been retrofitted with bulletproof glass. The years following the acquittal saw the architect enter his most bizarre phase. He leaned into the surreal. He created Trapped in the Closet, an operetta that was as brilliant as it was unhinged. This was the grand distraction. While he was being lauded for his eccentric genius, the velvet cage was becoming more restrictive. New reports began to surface of sex cults and brainwashing. But because Kelly had become a caricature of himself, a meme before memes existed, the public treated the allegations like just another plot. Twist in his soap opera. During this time, Kelly moved his operations to Atlanta, a city with a thriving music scene and a different set of shadows to hide in. He perfected the studio dormitory. He wasn't just recording music, he was housing students. The logic was simple. If you control their housing, their transportation, and their professional future, you don't need a physical lock. You own the air they breathe. This was the peak of his power, a man who had beaten the law and convinced the world that his darkness was just part of the show. But the architect made one fatal mistake. He didn't account for the change in the landscape. He had built his tower in the era of physical tapes and local news. He wasn't prepared for the digital panopticon. In the mid-Hang In Ler Muas, the Me Too movement changed the frequency of the world. What was once a private matter or industry gossip became a global conversation. The hashtag #MuterKelly began to do what the Hang In Ler Tam trial couldn't. It attacked his bank account. Streaming services began to pull his music from curated playlists. Labels began to distance themselves. For the first time, the commercial indispensability that had protected him in the Cheen Muse was gone. He was no longer a golden goose. He was a liability. The walls were closing in. The survivors were no longer isolated. They were connected. They were sharing their stories in real time, bypassing the enablers and the lawyers. The architect was finally losing control of the narrative. And in the distance, a documentary crew was beginning to roll their cameras. The final siege was about to begin. Every fortress has a breaking point. For the architect, it wasn't a court order or a police raid that finally cracked the foundation. It was a television broadcast. In Hang In Ler Mui Cheen, surviving R. Kelly didn't just tell a story, it humanized the statistics. For decades, the victims had been abstract concepts, faceless names in a legal brief. Now they had faces, they had trembling voices, they had parents who were grieving children who were still alive but lost inside the tower. The documentary did something the Hang In Ler Tam trial couldn't. It removed the genius shield. You couldn't listen to the soaring climax of a ballad without hearing the echoes of the testimonies. The gilded illusion shattered. The public didn't just turn away, they revolted. Within barely high hours of the premiere, the architect's world turned into a vacuum. The labels dropped him. The collaborators apologized. The fortress was finally under a total, modern blockade. The architect had spent his life beating local charges. He knew how to navigate the Chicago system, but he wasn't prepared for the federal hammer. Prosecutors did something brilliant and brutal. They didn't just charge him with individual crimes. They charged his entire operation as a criminal enterprise. They used the RICO Act, the same law designed to take down the mafia. By framing his inner circle, the drivers, the assistants, the bodyguards, as part of a racketeering conspiracy, the government turned the infrastructure of silence against him. The employees who had once guarded the doors were now being asked to testify about what happened behind them. The Heingenlair Heimweh Mort Brooklyn trial wasn't a he said, she said. It was a clinical autopsy of a 30-year operation. The evidence was no longer grainy tapes. It was flight records, hotel receipts, and the coordinated logistics of a predator. On September Heimweh Bay Heingenlair Heimweh Mort, the jury spoke. Guilty on all counts. The sentence? Bama years. Effectively a life term for a man in his mid-num muis. The man who once sang about flying was now grounded in a 14-foot cell. The architect who built a world where he was the only god found himself in a world where he was just a number. The music hadn't saved him. The money hadn't saved him. The cult of genius had finally run out of steam. So, what remains of the gilded illusion? His music still exists in the digital ether, but it is radiated. It's a toxic asset. To play it is to invite a conversation about morality, complicity, and the price of art. The story of the architect is a warning. It's a story of how society chooses its monsters, and how it protects them as long as they keep providing the soundtrack to our lives. It's a story of how talent can be used as a camouflage for the most profound darkness. The tower is gone. The architect is in exile. But the blueprint he created, the system of grooming, the NDAs, the culture of looking the other way, that blueprint is still out there. And as long as we value the art more than the artist's victims, someone else will eventually try to build another tower.